to this course, Green Economy from China's Stories. Okay, in previous section, we have learned the theory of low-carbon economy. In this section, let's move on and take a look into low-carbon economic practices in developed countries. After the concept of low-carbon economy was introduced, low-carbon economy thought has developed rapidly in the academic field, and governments of various countries also got engaged in low-carbon economic practices. The table on the right reflects the carbon emissions of major countries in the world after 2000. From that table, we can see that the carbon emissions of industrial countries remain high, and the carbon emissions of developing countries are also increasing. The urgency and importance of climate change has been gradually taken seriously. People realize that the high carbon economy in the era of industrial revolution must be reformed and changed. When facing with the serious climate problem, governments around the world are making great efforts to solve the problem. Why the governments around the world begin to transform their economy into low-carbon one after 2000? According to Stan's report, if global governments did nothing, the losses caused by climate change would be equal to about 5% to 20% of global GDP, which is equivalent to the sum of losses caused by both World War II and the Great Depression. The United Nations predicted that by 2040, the annual losses caused by weather disasters would have reached $3 trillion, accounting for 3% of the current global GDP. According to McKinsey estimates, by 2050, the total cost for climate mitigation would have accounted for about 0.6% to 1.4% of global GDP. And before 2030, one-third of this cost would have been paid from our budget. The Stan Review points out the vision that by 2030, we will have achieved the goal of stabilizing the concentrations of greenhouse gases on a certain level, at a global cost equal to about 3.9% and 3.4% of the world's GDP. So, what the governments have faced in developing a low-carbon economy was that on one hand, the society was being pushed to find a new way for development because the industrialized society had been unable to purify itself. On the other hand, low-carbon technologies had been breakthroughs and upgrades, so these governments got necessary technologies to build their low-carbon economies, and thereby widened the application of low-carbon economics practice. The pros of no-carbon practice can be divided also into 3 stages. The first stage is from the beginning of 1999 to 23, which we call the infant stage. This stage is based on the creation of the theoretical framework of low-carbon economics by Brown. From 2003 to 2013 is the is the development period of low-carbon economic practices. This stage starts with the British Energy White Paper issued in 2023. Our Energy Future, Creating a Low-Carbon Economy. Then China issued a National Assessment Report in 2026. The U.S. Senate proposed a Low-Carbon Economy Act in 2007. Some other examples followed, such as Japan, Switzerland. During this stage, major developed countries and developing countries in the world launched their own long-term strategies for a low-carbon economy. From 2003 to the present is a perfecting stage of low-carbon economic practices. The practices in different countries can be divided into three parts. First, the implementation of policies for reduction of carbon emissions. Second, the establishment of a corresponding legal system. Third, the establishment of a low-carbon economic assessment system. It is worth noting that China's proposal to develop a low-carbon economy is practically on the same starting line as developed countries. Let's learn about low-carbon practices in major countries. First, the United States. The United States has been criticized by the international community for having refused to sign the Kyoto Protocol. There are three reasons for that. Why the United States refused to sign the Kyoto Protocol? First, it was too costly for the U.S. to achieve the goals set in the Kyoto Protocol, which will cause a loss of $400 billion to the U.S. economy and reduce 4.9 million job positions, as well as the employment rate. Second, most developing countries, especially the U.S., think China, India, Brazil, had not been taken effectively measures to contribute to emission reduction. They thought the protocol was unfair. Third, there were many uncertainties in the issues of climate change. The United States received widespread criticism from the international world due to the refusal to sign the Kyoto Protocol. However, the United States has attracted the most venture capital and private investment for sustainable energy development. Federal regulations on fields like production and tax reduction has also promoted the development and the use of sustainable energy and the low-carbon economy in the U.S. In fact, given the influence of financial crisis, low-carbon technologies, and the new energy economy have become important strategic choices of the U.S. for revitalization. Since 2009, the U.S. government has been planning to invest $100 billion within 2 years in order to greatly promote green employment in areas such as clean energy, smart power grid, and building renovation. This investment is expected to reduce the environmental damage caused by energy demand, increasing green job positions, and thereby alleviate the pressure from unemployment caused by the upgrades of production capacity mix and the industrial structure upgrading American companies always attach great importance to the development and the use of new energy technologies and have made great progress in high-function electromagnetic and solar energy equipment. In 2009, Obama announced the U.S. Recovery and Reinvestment Plan, which was aimed to invest $150 billion in the development of new energies and to double its investment in 3 years. Now, let's take a look at the low-carbon economic practice in the UK, aiming at reducing carbon emissions and the impacts from global climate change. The nation enacted promoting policies and urged local governments to play a pioneering role in application of energy-saving technologies. Most of them have used low-carbon and energy-saving demonstration projects to popularize green practices in communities. The UK also issued a strategic framework for encountering climate change nationwide and proposed a vision for a global low-carbon economy. As estimated by the UK, the influence of the low-carbon revolution will have an influence as profound as the first industrial revolution. Now, let's take a look at the low-carbon economic practices in Japan. Japan has made efforts in legislation, industry, and national strategy to develop a low-carbon economy. In legislation, the Japanese government has enacted the national law on reasonable use of energies and renewable resources, the law on waste disposal, the law on improvement of removal and management of chemicals, and the long-term plan for energy supply and demand in 2010. For industrial sectors, Japan announced an industrial innovation strategy in 2004, focusing on 7 fields including fuel cells. The Cabinet of Japan enacted the National Environment Strategy for the 21st century, stating that in order to overcome environmental crises such as global warming and achieve a sustainable society, it is necessary to take comprehensive measures to get the balance between low-carbon society, circular society, and natural resources. In 2008, Yuzo Fukuda gave a speech titled with "Working Hard for a Low-Carbon Society in Japan," proposing Japan's new measures to prevent global warming and the famous Fukuda Blueprint, which is the official epitome of Japan's low-carbon strategies. It includes technological innovation, institutional reform, and new lifestyles in response to low-carbon development. In order to achieve a low-carbon society, the Japanese government has adopted comprehensive measures and long-term plans to reform its industrial structure, finance development of infrastructures, promote private investment in proven energy-saving technologies, and innovation in low-carbon technologies, and provide strong financial support for technologies that can capture and contain greenhouse gases in a large scale. The Japanese government proposed that these measures and plans should be executed on a trial basis in a large scale in 2009, and officially implemented before 2020. Other countries have implemented a series of strategies and measures for a low-carbon economy. You can see the table for the details. For example, Australia has implemented a cap and trade mechanism to reduce carbon emissions in July 2011 and promised a 25% reduction in emissions by 2020, compared with those of 2000. Brazil has implemented a national policy on energy efficiency in order to achieve an annual power-saving goal of 106 billion kilowatt-hours by 2030, which is equal to reducing carbon emissions by 30 million tons a year. Costa Rica, France, Mexico, Norway, and South Africa have also taken a series of measures, which means that the world is increasingly concerned about the potential economic, social, and political benefits of economic transformation. They have done this in order to seize historical opportunities for better development, rather than being hesitating with the fear of the cost of carbon reduction. By 2050, the value of the annual output of global low-carbon products is expected to reach at least $500 billion or even more, according to estimates by the International Energy Agency. To keep the concentration of carbon dioxide below 450 ppm, investment must be increased by 18%. And by 2050, the investment is expected to need an annual increase in average of $1 trillion. Low-carbon economic practices are bringing tremendous changes to the world. It may change the trade pattern in the near future. Carbon dioxide emissions related to trades are expected to be controlled more strictly, so those emerging countries whose development is relying on exports will face great changes. Many U.S. legislators agree on and support the imposition of carbon tariffs on commodities from developing countries that have not taken comparable measures to limit greenhouse gas emissions. This view is also endorsed by many European governments and legislators that may change the consumer behavior of the public. The European Union and the United States have taken many measures on public and private sectors to assess the carbon content of specific commodities, as to establish a carbon identification mechanism for consumers. The British government is cooperating with the Carbon Trust to develop a method to assess carbon impacts of products, namely to identify the grams of carbon per kilograms of the product for its lifetime. The factors taken into account in the circular include the shelf life of the product, the country of origin, the infrastructure of the country of origin, and the transportation distance of the finished food product. In addition, the size of the global carbon market is likely far huger than the petroleum market. Waxman Markey Bill of the United States shows that by 2020, the annual output of the carbon trade market is expected to reach trillion US dollars, twice the value of the European emissions trading mechanism. South Korea decided in 2008 to establish a mandatory domestic emissions trading carbon mechanism, and Australia began to run the same mechanism in July 2011. In 2008, Japan announced that it will initiate an assessment on the practice of the emission trading mechanism. In addition, it may affect the standard practice of capital markets and financial institutions. In further 5 to 15 years, it is expected that how a company discloses its carbon information will determine its stock value. The question we are facing today is no longer whether low-carbon transformation is needed, but how fast and how large the transformation can be. Develop a low-carbon economy is not only an effective way out of the current economic crisis, but also a possible method for ensuring sustained growth in the medium and long term. Compared with the risks of investments in traditional sectors, advantages of investments in low-carbon products and services are more obvious. Okay, this is the introduction to low-carbon economic practice in the developed countries and their influence. Thank you. See you next time.